The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint tick of the old clock above the judge's bench. Every eye was locked on the man in the witness stand, Officer Daniel Briggs. For 15 years, he'd worn the badge with pride and a certain arrogance. He'd testified in dozens of trials, leaned on his reputation to sway juries, and walked out of every courtroom as the unshakable authority figure. But today felt different. He just didn't know why yet. On the other side of the room sat the defendant, Alexandra Carter, the woman Daniel believed had wronged him. In his mind, she was about to be publicly humiliated, legally crushed, and financially ruined. But what Daniel didn't know was that he had just dragged the wrong woman into court. And before the day was over, his entire career, his power, and his untouchable image would crumble in front of everyone. The case had started 6 months earlier in the city's East Side district. Daniel was on patrol when he spotted a group of residents protesting outside a rundown apartment complex. The building was slated for demolition, and dozens of low-income tenants were fighting eviction. Among them was Alexandra Carter. Daniel didn't know her, but he noticed how she spoke to the crowd. Clear, commanding, unafraid. When the building's owner arrived with his lawyers, tempers flared. Daniel stepped in, claiming he was there to keep the peace. But Alexandra remembered it differently. She said Daniel used his badge as a weapon, pushing people back, threatening arrest, and singling her out when she challenged his orders. Their confrontation ended with Daniel filing a police report accusing her of disorderly conduct, interference, and harassment. Those charges were eventually dropped, but Daniel wasn't satisfied. His ego had taken a hit, and he wanted the last word. So he did something bold. He filed a civil harassment lawsuit against her. The morning of the first hearing, Daniel walked into the courtroom like he owned it. He was in full uniform, badge gleaming, and even nodded to a couple of officers seated in the back row for moral support. Alexandra arrived a few minutes later, alone, carrying a slim leather briefcase. She wore a navy blue suit, hair pulled neatly back, and an expression that could be mistaken for polite indifference. When the clerk called the case, Daniel's attorney, a young ambitious lawyer named Ryan, rose to speak. Ryan painted a picture of Alexandra as an aggressive activist who had verbally attacked an officer in the line of duty, harassed him during a lawful operation, and damaged his reputation. Daniel sat there with his arms folded, chin slightly raised, drinking it in. Then it was Alexandra's turn. She stood slowly, walked to the center of the room, and said in a calm, steady voice, "Your Honor, my name is Alexandra Carter. I am the defendant in this case, and I will also be representing myself." Daniel's smirk flickered for the briefest second. She continued, "Before we proceed, I have a few disclosures to make about Officer Briggs." Alexandra pulled a folder from her briefcase and handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. Inside were two previous complaints filed against Daniel, both from women who claimed he'd used his position to intimidate them during unrelated disputes. Neither complaint had gone to trial, but both were documented and signed. Daniel shifted in his seat. His attorney objected immediately, claiming the information was irrelevant. But Alexandra wasn't finished. She turned toward Daniel and, in front of the entire courtroom, said, "Officer Briggs, do you recall the night of March 17th last year?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Not specifically," he replied. "Would it refresh your memory if I reminded you that you pulled over a 19-year-old college student?" kept her on the side of the road for 40 minutes, and then arrested her for failure to obey after she asked why she was being stopped. The room went dead silent. Daniel's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear. Alexandra calmly handed another set of documents to the court, dash cam footage from that exact night. The judge agreed to review the footage before allowing it as evidence, but the damage was already done. By the second hearing, word had spread. More people showed up to watch. The gallery buzzed with whispers about the cop who might finally be held accountable. Alexandra had done her homework. She began cross-examining Daniel in a way no one ever had, methodically, respectfully, but with precision. She didn't just focus on the protest incident. She built a timeline of questionable actions, minor abuses of authority, and moments where Daniel had stretched the truth in his reports. At first, Daniel responded with the same confidence he always had. But over time, his answers grew shorter. His gaze shifted more. And Alexandra. She didn't raise her voice once. On the third day of testimony, Alexandra dropped her biggest revelation. She called a surprise witness, a fellow officer named Miguel Torres. Miguel looked uneasy, but when sworn in, he testified under oath that Daniel had admitted, in the precinct locker room, that he'd filed the harassment suit against Alexandra just to teach her a lesson. Gasps filled the room. Daniel's attorney objected, calling it hearsay, but the judge allowed the statement for the record. Alexandra turned to Daniel and asked, "Officer Briggs, is that how you view the court system? As a personal tool for revenge?" Daniel didn't answer right away. The silence was louder than any denial he could have given. When closing arguments came, Daniel's lawyer tried to salvage the case, insisting this was about protecting an officer's dignity and authority. But Alexandra's closing was different. She looked directly at the judge and said, "Your Honor, the badge is meant to represent service and protection, not fear and retaliation. If we allow officers to weaponize their authority against private citizens who speak up, we don't just fail those citizens. We fail the very principles of justice this court stands for." The verdict was swift. The judge ruled in Alexandra's favor, dismissed Daniel's lawsuit entirely, and, in a rare move, referred his conduct to the city's Internal Affairs Division for review. Within months, Daniel was suspended pending investigation. The local paper ran a front-page story on the case, calling it a badge misused. As for Alexandra, she went back to her legal work, but her quiet, relentless dismantling of Daniel Briggs became something of a legend in the courthouse halls. And for the first time in his career, Daniel learned that a badge might protect you from a lot of things, but not from the truth.